Acoustic. I love the music.
And thank you for coming back to Hanging with History. This is Season 1, that miracle that happened, that one time. And we're concluding the Elizabethan era with the Elizabethan era Part 7, the new industries, economic progress. Money makes the world go round. The miracle happened because and I have a new guest to introduce. This is Leisure Larry. And you'll see he has some expertise in economics and leisure suits and just laying around generally not doing anything. The miracle happened because the British were more inventive, more innovative, more effectively organized than any other people in the world. There was plenty of international rivalry to stimulate their activities. Right? This mattered. An existential contest first with Spain and then another one with France. But also lots of internal peace and therefore predictability. There were still really terrible government, perhaps good for its time, but with so much ability and inclination to interfere in the economy that we are holding ourselves back, not realizing our full potential. Most are mired in poverty. Anthropologists would say that the nuclear family structure, neither egalitarian nor unegalitarian, provided the maximally most flexible society possible, and only flexibility could cope with the changes to come. Furthermore, the practice of sending out young people to work as servants led to amazing geographical mobility, as we've covered, and vitally the accumulation of savings by young people that could be used to set up house in the relatively late marriages that everyone except kings are not having with their cousins.
Not marrying cousins? What are you talking about?
People have to go back to episode 3 for the anthropology of exogamous nuclear families. It covers Emmanuel Todd's lineages of modernity, where he draws direct lines to the miracle. Look, this need to save before marriage and procreation may, controversially, have led to cultural selection pressure for the very idea of savings and capital accumulation, deferring pleasure today for greater pleasure tomorrow, namely penetrative vaginal sex. In other words, was being built into the very culture itself as a foundational part of society. Right? Without that ability to set up house on your own, no marriage, no sex, no children. So what gets passed down? The people who can do that. In more modern terms, they were building a society that could pass the Marshmallow Test.
Is that Marshmallow Test a coherent concept? Can a society be said to be able to pass the Marshmallow Test? And how does that help explain the miracle? Is there evidence that societies that did not industrialize were poor savers?
Well, we only had one industrial revolution, with Britain and the United Provinces as a trigger and the North American colonies playing a supporting role. It's not the ability to save all by itself, but within the context of individual choices within a society of nuclear family structures as opposed to STEM, communitarian, or authoritarian endogamous families. Joe Heinrich's weird thesis depends on this sort of cultural evolution. I'm making an extension of it and adding this Marshmallow Test framing. You don't have to accept it, but I rather like the idea. We covered the growing prosperity among all classes as stick and mud huts gave way to brick and timber cottages with raised floors and kitchens. Statistically, it appeared things were going backwards, yet the material evidence would argue the contrary. We know a huge move forward in the availability of small luxuries for poor people starts now and develops into a pretty interesting consumer economy over the 17th century. Cottagers and laborers are living in those mud huts with the thatched roof and the dirt floors and sleep on straw. They're 2/3 of the population at least, probably more. They basically have nothing, and they live hand to mouth. The man is earning 3 to 4 shillings a week, and if they do have a penny left over, there really isn't anything they could realistically expect to buy. Everything beyond the necessities of clothing and food and fuel is unavailable out in the country. And this sounds bleak and exaggerated, but it really isn't. Well, okay. Maybe your grandfather made a bench and passed it to you. Perhaps an uncle gave you a pair of wooden bowls as a wedding present. And perhaps you have an auntie who weaves baskets. I mean, this is what I'm talking about. How do you get from here to a reasonably thriving consumer economy with many small comforts over the next 100 years? Now, this is a big question. Lots of Tudor history focuses on big new industries. It will be easy for you to learn how French foundry workers build an iron industry with new blast furnaces so that the crown can produce cannon. And this is very helpful for sure, because they don't need to make cannon year-round all the time, and they can diversify into tools and knives and pots and pans the rest of the time. And England was importing most of its iron from Spain in Henry's time, which would have been a big problem for Elizabeth, consider that. But the English iron industry rose to the challenge, use of iron quintupled, and Britain became self-sufficient by the end of Elizabeth's reign. Also, German miners brought new techniques to develop new sources of copper and brass being an alloy of copper and zinc. And of course, as we've mentioned many times, Flemish and Dutch weavers, refugees from the war caused by the Dutch Revolt, and cloth makers developed the textile industry. The shipbuilding industry is also copying foreign techniques and ship designs from the French and the Dutch. And all these are important, no question. But aside from mentioning them, I won't talk about them. This is part of the process of catching up. This is more like post-war Asian tiger economies applying existing technologies in locally appropriate ways and catching up to Western European living standards, and even surpassing them sometimes. But we on Hanging with History are concerned with the miracle lens, so catching up is certainly important. Making judicious use of foreign skills and technical knowledge are vital. What counts here, though, is openness to outside talent, and not making the mistake of oppressing your best people and driving them out of the country, not falling for the not invented here fallacy, because that's what everyone does in history all the time. Remember, practically all societies have to fail in order for England to be the one that succeeds. Anyway, southwest Germany would see lots of Protestant crushing to England's gain. France would send their Huguenots, Flanders their Calvinists. It's not the religion that matters, but the skills, grit, and the work ethic they bring. The miracle lens is about how Britain pulled ahead. And we're going to hit some items of small industrial progress as the seeds of this. And this is consistent with the other threads we've shown. The minimally murdery bits, the unity of being a people chosen by God, the remarkably gentle, compared to everyone else at the time at least, minimally brutal administration of justice, the notion that everyone has rights, what they have in their mental, emotional, and spiritual toolbox. As Quokka put it in episode 30, "Give me pirates. All you want to do is talk about the importance of being nice." Well, this is not namby-pamby being nice. This is about cold-blooded effectiveness, life and death stuff. Last place I worked, where people were actually foolish enough to pay me, we proved that innovation was really important stuff within firms. Obvious, you say. We also proved where, or should I say who, innovation came from. And the answer was that it might come from almost anyone, not just tech gurus, blue bloods, or Harvard grads, but anyone. To get the benefit of innovation, you had to listen. Arrogant noblemen often have a problem with this. To get people to speak up, they have to trust you. Tricky one. Tricky. For people to trust you, you have to demonstrate that you are trustworthy. Double tricky. If you can do that, if you can be that, you can make millions. And combine it with luck, ambition, good strategy, and billions are available. You can also win existential wars with bigger powers like France, which is no small thing. So, okay, Spain is beaten, France has got to be beaten also. Science and technology will develop in an international way, but the applied engineering, actually figuring out how to do it every day, will happen in Britain. And let's talk about some of the baby steps involved. One interesting industry was lead production, and thanks to Anton Howes for the tip. Thanks to Cromwell, England has a lot of lead available to dump on the international market. Remember, monastery roofs were usually lined with lead. good fire-resistant stuff, right? And the monastery's lead was stripped down and the lead sold for benefit of God and King. So, lead from a few roofs. Big deal, I hear you say. That can't be much. But it was. At 12,000 tons, it was over a year's worth of lead production in all Europe. And it wasn't sold at once, of course, but it did depress prices, and most producers were driven out of business as market prices were below the cost of production. So if it costs you $100 a ton to produce, but you can only sell it for $95 a ton, you go find something else to do. Somehow, someone in Wales, and despite my boast in episode 30, was it, that we would know their names, we don't know his name. He figured out a new furnace process to get lead from ore that was previously too low quality to use. So England became the new low-price producer in Europe. And thanks to all that monastery lead selling, English merchants were also doing all the business. And England became the leading lead producer from the 1590s, in good time to supply both sides with bullets in the 30 Years' War. But this is mostly going to be about small industry in rural areas. Joan Thirsk, I am forever indebted to you and your description of woad growing and other small-scale industries. Woad is a plant you can use for blue dye. I'm wearing a blue shirt as I speak. It brings out the color of my eyes. Who would not want blue dye? And woad growing spread over England rapidly in the 1580s, and it brought with it jobs and lots of jobs. To cultivate an acre of woad, you need 4 women and children for weeding and picking. You pick the leaves 2 or 3 times a season. Now, for a family, this was big, so instead of earning 3 to 4 shillings a week off the man's wages, with a wife and 2 children working as well, your family would take in 6 shillings a week. Yes, that's right, do the math. There is not equality when it comes to wages. Big surprise. But 6 shillings a week created enough income for a little luxury. Maybe a brass pot in the kitchen, a comfortable hat, or woolen stockings for your feet. And you couldn't grow woad everywhere, but get this, 15 acres of woad growing would employ the idle hands of the average village cluster. And that's not to say all employment problems were solved, but a lot were. And then there were the woolen stockings I mentioned. These were starting to become standard clothing for yeomen and better, and would go down into society as prices fell, and people were able to afford it over the next few decades. And these added greatly to comfort. People needed a couple a year, and as the population rose to 5 million, well, you need 10 million a year. And, of course, the export market was huge, huge, huge. Everyone needs warm feet. And when Dumbledore, at the end of Book 1, mentions this, I think of a time before those woolen stockings were widely available. And just imagine a time before socks are an affordable clothing item. And of course, grades of quality were there. The gentry couldn't be seen wearing the rough, thick stockings of the poor. Patterns, colors, all that lovely blue dyed yarn could be put to use now. And stocking knitting underwent a revolutionary transformation when stockings could be made a fashion item. And this connected with better knitting techniques, better wool yarn and color. And they copied lots of foreign designs. Fancy, expensive Italian designs could be knocked off cheaply in England. Men and women were both knitters, and much of it was done by people who had a little free time, particularly like those employed in caring for animals. Pastoral regions became major centers of production. They exported to Holland, Germany, and France, and even Spain when that was possible. But 90% was for domestic consumption. People could make their own tools. The knitting needles were not expensive, and later they started to use frames and forms, which weren't too expensive. Then you could just make as many as you could make, and make modest incomes. And this is not going to get you rich. But well over 100,000 people are employed in this, and many more in distribution and sales, of course. And because it was new and grew fast, there was little in the way of harmful regulation or taxation at first. And when there was regulation, which is coming, like mold grows on cheese eventually, the distribution methods made regulation easy to evade. So how did this work? A village or even isolated houses made a few stockings. A man called a chapman would come by carrying a big backpack and pick up your stockings. Often Scotsmen had this job for some reason. Hard work, outdoor in all weathers, and also requires practical intelligence. The Scots will set the world on fire and for a time be the most influential people in the world. Not yet, though. The chapman would go to a warehouse and unload there for further distribution. A merchant would buy them for sale overseas or to market towns. Another chapman would carry stockings directly to small retailers all over the country. At every step in this great swirl of trade, there was a small credit transaction, yes, credit, and money would flow on a subsequent cycle. Oh, this is such an advance. The whole operation worked, but depended on trust, freedom from crime, and peace in order to function. Only the honest, people of good reputation and reliable memory need apply. So we've got cultural evolution happening with savings and marriage, and also with this form of internal trade. Oh, and at least a few of you will remember the equation PY equals MV from freshman economics. It has its flaws because GDP is a concept they're trying really hard to get right, but it's a quest that can't really succeed. Anyway, all this activity is increasing the V part of MV as well as the Y part of PY. The national income is building as the most humble people move from bare subsistence to adding small comforts. And if you are of a mindset that we put too much importance on economic growth over economic fairness, well, let me refer you to episode 7, where a Viking story disguises a mathematical lesson on exponential growth. There, we made the point that 1% growth per year for 100 years is the difference in lifestyle between Mexico and the United States. This is cold reality. If you care about the poor, as Jesus wants you to, and Pascal is standing right over there in the corner, look at him, ready to mug you. More long-term economic growth is more effective in the real world than anything else known at alleviating poverty. Less economic growth is more poverty and less capacity to deal with big problems, like war with France. End of digression. No, not quite. If you want to go deep into the weeds of useful economic analysis, go over to Random Critical Analysis, the webpage, and that particular post, Why Everything You Think You Know About Healthcare is Wrong in 1 million charts. It's excellent. And don't be afraid, they're not really 1 million charts, and it's not about healthcare. It's about actual individual consumption as an alternative to NGDP, as a tool to compare economic numbers to real things. Turns out Robin Hanson was right about that elephant yet again. All right, real end of digression. Now, all this distribution of goods by foot, of course, is expensive. So you can see huge gains to come from better roads so that animal power could be used, better canals, and the big one, railroads, and of course, sea traffic. And this is all going to drive down costs and prices as we go through our story, contributing to the end of poverty. And one of the great trade cycles involved coal from Newcastle to London as London's population exploded. This trade went by sea down the east coast of England. Overland trade would have been too costly. And I suppose we need some big picture theory and great men stuff, stock in trade of history, but be careful. It is as likely to mislead as it is to edify. Everyone thinks that the policy of the time was mercantilism. Export was all, and a favorable balance of payments leads to an increase in the national treasure. And we'll cover this in more detail next episode. Of course, this is wrong. Adam Smith was right. Ricardo was right. However, when you dive deep into mercantile policies in England, and I'll make liberal use of Joan Thirsk's analysis of a book from 1549, Discourses of the Commonweal by Thomas Smith, not Adam. An inquiry into the causes and the wealth of nations didn't come out until 1776, recall. The 1549 discourse isn't just focused on the balance of trade. It's concerned with improving the country, i.e. the commonweal, and in helping the poor. And the primary way to help the poor is understood to be work, jobs. that if the then poor would work at producing imported things, then two great things would happen. The poor would be poor no longer, and the balance of payments would improve. The balance of trade was a bugaboo that everybody knew about, so this was a good rhetorical device. It was polemics.
A trade deficit is the same kind of bugaboo today. A little different, of course, because the fiat currency is different from hard currency. People get excited about a trade deficit. They think it's wrong, but actually it's just identical to saying you have a capital surplus. Your trade deficit and capital surplus are equal and offsetting always.
Right. So you can worry about a loss of manufacturing ability, you can worry about jobs, you can worry about strategic things like why do we import rare earths when we have an infinite amount of it in the ground right here?
It's funny that despite the name, rare earths are not rare.
They're often toxic as hell, though. So any place with health and safety and environmental regulation will be hard-pressed to mine and process rare earths.
You can worry about all kinds of things related to foreign trade. You might even want to limit foreign capital in certain circumstances. Basically, you should act directly on things you're concerned about. Focusing on abstract accounting identities, like a trade deficit, is just like a political trick or con. Actually, Harold, you should just let trade be free if you want the highest economic growth.
Well, yeah, but I don't think I can even say one more word without violating the rule that says we don't touch current politics on hanging with history with someone else's 10-foot pole.
We can stick to history. The Irish potato famine killed millions. The potato blight wasn't caused by anyone, but mercantilist regulation in the form of corn laws prevented cheap grain being imported for the Irish, and therefore millions starved. Regulation caused the deaths. Finally, everyone realized free trade was better, and free trade won the argument.
Yeah, okay, the 19th century is distant enough. Let's go back to Elizabeth's time, though. Thomas Smith was worried about foreign iron, woad, and oil, especially because they cost 1/3 more in 1549 than 6 years before. In that context, developing a domestic industry made a lot of sense, as it did with iron, as we mentioned, and woad too. Domestic oil was encouraged by draining the fens, where flax and hemp could be grown for oil, but also fibers for sails, sackcloth, and ordinary thread. It caused the price to fall, and England would actually start to export these things that they had imported. So employment goes up, the national income goes up, poverty is alleviated, and the abstraction that they're worried about, the balance of payments, is helped as well. So a lot of our story is about falling prices. Grain prices fell about 25% in 1583 and 1584, which helped drive woad production. Also, at this time, it was not allowed to export grain from England, on the theory that that would help feed the poor at home. Really, they were obsessed about the poor.
That's a classic blunder. Theory would predict that land and labor producing grain would decline, and farmers would switch to other crops. Is that what happened?
It did indeed. Another one was alum, vital chemical and cloth production. And this time Spain, which supplied the English market, raised export taxes.
I predict the English found alternative sources or substitutes.
And that's also right. A domestic industry started, and they invented some new techniques, and soon were producing the highest quality alum anywhere. Then there were what were called the new draperies. Many, many different kinds of cloth and clothing which had not been made in England before, and therefore were not under control of any guilds and were basically unregulated.
Theory would predict rapid growth and a great deal of innovation. Possibly they could achieve international competitiveness.
And that's right, too. What was called the new draperies created a lot of wealth and employment in Britain, and Britain found another new arena in which to lead the world. And there would be almost endless innovation in production, in quality, which would lead to greater employment, lower prices, and even the poorest could afford to have more than one set of clothes.
We have accomplished some advances in economics. Are you going to mention the fallacy of the apples of Carnarvon?
Yeah, that's a good one for misunderstanding value. And then the whole attitude towards middlemen and misunderstanding economic efficiency. The fallacy of the apples of Carnarvon, if I'm saying it right. It's a city in Wales, a port city in Wales. But, we're going to bleed into the Stuart period now, so let's call a halt to the Elizabethan age. Yay, everybody, we did it. The economics part is important, and certainly Cecil did encourage a lot of immigrants with skills to settle. But I think we're ready for the 17th century and what we can call that time before the Civil War. And a big thanks to LL, Leisure Larry. You brought some really good applications of economic theory to the Elizabethan era, something too often ignored except by the specialists.
Okay, we'll figure it out.
And we have a surprise for Conversations with Camie. We're actually going to have conversations with Charlie's Angel. We just had a chance to listen to episode 35. What'd you think?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. With my areas of expertise, I really enjoyed the Dumbledore reference and also the discussion around the Marshmallow Test. I will say I've never heard the Marshmallow Test in reference to more of a macro perspective of culture or of communities, so that was interesting to me.
Right. I don't know that anyone else has ever done that before. It may not make sense. Leisure Larry called it some attention to that, but maybe people don't know as much about the Marshmallow Test as they'd like, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about it, what it really is.
Yeah, so the Marshmallow Test was created by Walter Mischel, although I might be mispronouncing his last name, and it's really about examining delayed gratification in children.
The odd sounds you hear are a very sweet old dog moving around.
So the test itself, it's actually really fun to watch videos of kids doing this, because there's some really adorable videos on, I think probably YouTube, you can look some up. Basically what you do is you sit down a kid who's probably somewhere between toddler range to 10 or 8, and you put a marshmallow on a plate and set it in front of them and say, okay, I'm going to leave the room for a certain amount of time, and if you don't eat this marshmallow, then when I come back, you can have 2 marshmallows instead of 1. So it's really looking at how kids deal with emotional regulation and being able to delay their gratification, because some kids will just eat the marshmallow right away without even really thinking about the fact that if they wait for a minute or 5 or 10, however long, then they'll get a better sort of return on their investments almost.
I've always thought a confounding factor, though, to that test was trust. That the kids if the kids didn't trust the adults, then just grabbing the marshmallow and eating it would be the right thing to do. But so just grabbing the marshmallow would be the right thing to do if the kid didn't trust the adult. Whereas waiting for 2 marshmallows makes more sense if they do trust the adult, and if they're able to, delay their gratification for a few seconds.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, one of my professors, she mentioned that the relationship between it would be a researcher who provides the test, and the relationship to the child who the test is being administered to is actually a pretty important factor.
Yeah, okay.
There have been other forms of the Marshmallow Test that's really about examining delayed gratification, where a child is told that when they want to have the treat, they ring a bell, and the researcher will come back into the room. And in some cases, the child might be more interested in getting the attention from the researcher, and so will ring the bell immediately to get the researcher to come back in, rather than waiting for their treat, which is what the proposed design of the study sort of implies.
Yeah, these things are so hard to study, because you can immediately imagine another confounder there, which is that the kid might just want to ring the bell, because that's fun.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So maybe tell us a bit about some of the positive outcomes associated with the Marshmallow Test, that the kids who pass the test and wait for 2 marshmallows, what are the good things that are implied for those kids?
Yeah, so I believe those lead to higher academic outcomes later in life, and
I think less prison time and less drug addiction.
It kind of seems like it's connected to impulse control in that way. Something else that's interesting that a professor of mine mentioned was that she had worked with Walter Mischel. He had really wanted to show that delay of gratification is not necessarily an innate ability, but something that can be learned throughout life.
Aha.
Which is pretty much the opposite of what a lot of people took his research to be proving.
Right, yeah.
A learned behavior as opposed to an innate behavior, that might support the idea of cultural evolution.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, there's a strong argument. I think maybe it's intuitively easier to understand that kids can learn trust as they grow up, right? Or they could, maybe even if it works the other way, that they start out trusting, they could learn, a lack of trust. But, so learning has an impact.
It's interesting how trust really connects to the stock industry that you mentioned during the podcast, and the importance of credit. And I was curious what happens when or if trust fails.
People really underestimate the importance of credit. It's just absolutely vital.
And credit is based on trust in this context.
For economic growth, all the parties that are involved in all the activities that result in good things don't have to have immediate cash on hand to facilitate their piece of it.
The one thing that really comes to mind when I think about the use of credit, when it's used really by a lot of people, is the 1929 economic crash.
Say some more.
So in thinking about credit and about trust, interesting to me when those processes don't work the way that they're intended to, and how that can actually lead to potential...
Oh, that's where disaster fits in. So if you have some sort of economic structure where people's livelihoods are all dependent on the constant flow of credit, and then something causes it to seize up, like a sudden decrease in the quantity of money, which is what happened in 1929. And then all economic activity ceases and people don't pay each other, and it's, chaos and disaster and high unemployment results. Yeah. But unfortunately, getting to that, nice place that everyone was in 1929, required the credit to be there.
Yeah.
And I think the policy failures of 1929 with the central bank, led by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, decided that the best thing to do in response to the stock market crash was to greatly decrease the money supply, and then tragedy results.
The 1549 discourse on helping the poor by giving them jobs is interesting to me in how it connects to potential current social services and the New Deal and other forms of social services that attempt to uplift the poor by providing positions and jobs, opportunities.
Yeah, by our standards, I think they did relatively little in the way of giving people jobs. It was more of introducing new technologies and starting new industries so that, people would work out ways to, employ themselves and employ each other, as opposed to make-work programs. There were a few make-work programs. We've talked about the way that parishes handled, groundbreaking way that parishes handled poor relief in Tudor England. They started to develop workhouses. Some small examples I can think of was a guy, he started in Gloucester and went around to a few other cities, and he started pin factories, and he started teaching teenage children how to make pins. And he would basically start this small pin factory, employing about 35 people with about 30 poor boys. And those three are notable successes. In fact, a world-leading pin industry began around those first projects. But I sort of wonder if we only hear about them because, they were the big successes. I mean, even with woad growing, which we talked about quite a bit, it employed a lot of people per acre, a lot more than cereal production. But there was a time, right around 1585, when the government forbade woad growing. It didn't stop it, but they forbade woad growing because it took land out of grain production, and it was thought oh, this is a terrible thing if we do this. Allow land to leave grain production. Then the poor will starve.
It's this crazy paradox they could not see. Yeah. I mean, you need grain for people to eat, but people need money too. And the Dutch lesson is that you can import grain.
The starvation was a thing in living memory, and certainly they saw hardship all around them. But it's an underappreciated thing now how concerned people were for the poor back in Tudor times. And, I've been using that metaphor of Pascal's wager and Pascal's mugging to explain that even though, Pascal, he wasn't around yet. Pascal was, wrote in the mid-17th century, that the justices of the peace that really ran England outside of London and the towns, basically applying Pascal's wager to their own lives and treating people as if they had serious responsibility for the areas around them that they were, in effect, the little dictators of. And of the poor people around them were their responsibility, and that therefore they needed to be relatively mild in justice and try to do as much as they could for people, because there was this moment of judgment that they were expecting to undergo themselves. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because, of course, you would think that that would be an issue for all Christians, mm-hmm. but we don't see this kind of behavior in other places in Europe at this time. All right, so thank you, Charlie's Angel. Really glad to have you on the program.
Thanks for having me on.
Please click subscribe or follow on your podcast app. If you like the podcast, please tell a friend about it. If you don't, please tell an enemy.
If you're on Twitter X, go find me and give me a follow.
Thank you for listening.